Today we're going to make a concrete chair. Lately I've been really into the idea of having a home office that's outdoors, and a concrete chair would be perfect since it would be nice and weatherproof and it wouldn't blow over either. So I started by taking apart this chair that I got off of Amazon. Now, it's a decent looking chair, but it's not super well made and the parts are always coming loose. So I had this idea sitting in the back of my head about using Quickwall plaster to make a concrete chair, and I thought an easy way to test it out would be in using the back of the plastic chair seat as a mold. So I slapped together a quick 2x4 structure to support this chair seat upside down so I could hand pack on the Quickwall right on top of it. Quickwall is a concrete plaster that's often used as a skim coating over cinder blocks or concrete masonry units. It's really strong because it has fiberglass strands mixed in with the cementitious powder. Now all you have to do is add water to a bag of Quickwall to get a nice strong white plaster, but I want the first layer of the chair to be gray, so I mix some Quikrete charcoal pigment into the water before adding the water to the Quickwall. I kept adding water and mixing the Quickwall until it was about the consistency of Play-Doh, and then I just started hand applying it to the backside of the plastic seat. This was really easy, and the chair seat even has a little lip around the edges, which kept the plaster from sliding off. Now, almost all concrete products are very strong in terms of compressive strength, and this plaster has a compressive strength of 3,500 psi. What's unusual is that it's also pretty strong when it comes to flexural strength. And because of the glass fibers, Quickwall can reach a flexural strength of up to 800 psi. Now, this project was totally an experiment, and I think it's possible to make a chair just out of this Quickwall product and have it be strong enough, but I thought that some steel reinforcement might be a good idea. So after packing on a layer of Quickwall about 3/4 of an inch thick, I laid on this really elegantly made, beautiful, precise steel contraption that I threw together out of scrap steel, and here's how I made that. I started with a couple scrap pieces of 2-inch angle steel, and I had really no idea how I was going to make these legs for this chair, other than that it probably would be a good idea to have some holes in them so that I could then make the legs separately and bolt them on. I cut some scraps of plate to weld to the angle steel, and then I started thinking, well, how is this all going to tie into the Quickwall itself? So I welded on some short pieces of steel rod, cut some notches in them, and then bent them over to kind of create a steel mesh that was attached to these pieces of plate and angle. And then I thought, oh, speaking of mesh, I have some leftover expanded steel mesh that would be perfect. So I just started cutting pieces of this mesh with my angle grinder, kind of bending them and forming them to wrap them around the chair seat as much as possible. Now I knew I wasn't going to get it perfect, but that's okay. I'm going to use the thickness of all the Quickwall plaster to kind of hide the rough, ugly parts of all this steel. In the interest of trying to get the contours right, I took a scrap piece of plate steel, cut a bunch of notches in it so it'd be easy to bend, and then kind of form that around the curves of the seat. And then I sort of used this as a guide to help get the mesh all in the right position. Now these bumps on the backside of the chair seat were kind of getting in my way, so I just took my reciprocating saw and trimmed right through the plastic and steel inserts. I then sanded these stubs smooth with my angle grinder and a flap disc. I welded on the plate steel spine and then welded on the angle steel contraption that'll be my connection point to the legs. So I placed this steel monstrosity and gently worked it about 1/8 of an inch into the wet concrete plaster. I then started layering additional plaster over it and really making sure to push it through all the holes in the mesh. Now I quickly realized I was going to need a lot of material to completely cover all this steel, so I just mixed up a whole bag and started hand packing it over the mesh. This was really easy and kind of fun. It was like playing with Play-Doh or modeling clay or anything else. And you could kind of vibrate it with your hands too to try to remove some of the air bubbles, but really it's just about pushing down with your hands and fingers and smoothing it out to the best of your abilities. Now at first I was really just trying to cover the steel and fill in the gaps, but over time I started getting more comfortable working with the material, and I started seeing that you can really kind of smooth it or glide your hand over it to smooth out portions, even it out, and create nice contours and curves. So I started working up to the point where the angle steel was, and I was just trying to manage these contours as consistently as possible. But ultimately, this chair can look organic and hand formed, and I'm totally okay with if some of the curves aren't perfectly symmetrical. Now I made the mistake of not mixing enough of the charcoal water that will stain the Quickwall, and when I remixed the new batch, I put a little bit more of the pigment into it than I had in the previous batch, so this last layer of Quickwall came out a little bit darker. But that's okay, I was kind of curious to see what a two-tone Quickwall product would look like, so I mixed a batch of white and did the finish coat with just a plain white Quickwall. Now I had gotten called away to take care of a few other things, so the gray Quickwall had already started to cure and was a little bit dry, so I just sprinkled some water over it to make sure I'd get a nice bonding layer to the new white Quickwall. Now because this was going to be the final visible layer, I just went a little bit slower and really made sure to smooth out the layers with my hands. I want to let the concrete cure for 3 days before removing it from the mold, but for the first like 4 to 6 hours, I just spritzed it down with some clean water about every 2 hours just to keep it from cracking. I unscrewed the 2x4 support, and when I flipped the chair over, I saw that I'd actually formed some of the concrete right over the plastic chair piece itself. So I just took my chisel and scraped away around the edges just to get the plastic free and clear so that I could pry it off. I had no idea what to expect, but was pleasantly surprised to see a nice, hard, smooth gray concrete seat surface. Alright, so that was super encouraging. Let's get to the legs. So I immediately started by making a piece of steel that would fit inside this sort of bracket that the angle steel created, and I just did this with a couple more pieces of angle steel and one big piece of plate steel. I made this piece so it would fit inside the steel that was attached to the chair, so I just lined it up, marked the locations of the holes, and then drilled them out. Now I have a nice plate that'll attach to the concrete chair. For the legs themselves, I had some leftover 1¼ inch angle steel, and I just cut a couple pieces at angles. For the back legs, I'm going to set them at a 45, and for the front legs, I'm going to try 25 degrees. I cut 2 of these little spacer pieces and then ground down the edges to clean them up and get them ready for welding. I clamped these angled spacers on top of 2 other pieces of angle steel, and I used the angles that I cut on the spacers to define the angle of the legs. I started by using my Forney welder just to lightly tack them in place, and then flipped them over, made sure everything was still nice and square, and then welded in some heavy beads. I then used my angle grinder to trim the excess flush to the spacer piece. I want to weld these legs at an angle relative to the flat base plate. So I used my mag switch clamp to make a guide and clamped it to a piece of scrap steel so that it would hold the legs at just the right angle. I also used a couple of squeeze clamps and then welded the pieces together. I did the same thing for the other pair of legs, but started to see that I was really relying just on these welds between the plate steel and the angle steel, and so I decided to cut another spacer to go in between them and tie the 2 sets of legs together. Now the chair is quite heavy and I didn't want the legs to bend out over time, so I also just added in some 1/4 inch steel rod just to create some additional support between the legs. The design was starting to get a little clunky, but this is really just a proof of concept, and I just want to make sure it holds together well enough that I can actually test the chair and make sure it's strong enough. One of the things I like about using steel for the legs on furniture is that it's really easy to trim them afterwards to length and then grind them a little bit at a time till you get everything perfectly level. The chair seat fit perfectly onto the base, and I just slid in 4 machine screws to bolt everything together. Now I had gotten a little overzealous with the Quickwall, and I had sort of gone past the limits of the seat, which I was using as a mold. So I just put a diamond blade on my angle grinder and just trimmed the edge of the concrete chair. And this was super easy. I mean, those diamond blades go through concrete like butter, and in no time at all, I kind of reshaped the edge of the chair. Then I switched to a flap disc and ground it down nice and smooth. I then primed the steel with Rust-Oleum Rusty Metal Primer. I also primed the steel that was on the underside of the chair, and then painted both sets of steel white with Rust-Oleum Protective Enamel in flat white. I put the pieces back together, and now I have a pretty nice 80-pound, functional but not super sleek chair. Tested it out. It's plenty strong. I don't think I'm getting any cracks, and I think short of dropping it off the back of a truck, it's not going to break. It's going to hold up against the elements really nicely with both the Rust-Oleum and the fact that it's concrete. And now that I have this proof of concept, it makes sense to invest in a better design for the base. But this Quickwall is going to be a real game changer to my concrete projects. Being able to hand form things like this is really cool because it'll let me sort of work with more complicated positive molds and not always have to pour concrete in more like a liquid. So this really opens up the design possibilities, and I'm really excited to see what I can come up with. All right, thanks for watching. Be sure to check out some of our other concrete projects. And if you want to see the types of concrete products that I prefer, go to quickcrete.com. It's a great website. They have all the data sheets for all their different products, and they have a bunch of DIY projects and instructionals over there as well. All right, bye everybody.